If it's Tuesday, mass shootings rock Philadelphia and Fort Worth a day after 30 people were shot in Baltimore. The gun violence crisis continuing across America. Plus, new fears of an escalation in the cycle of violence between Israelis and Palestinians as Hamas praises a car ramming attack in Tel Aviv. And the Israeli military says some of its forces are withdrawing in that massive operation targeting militants inside the West Bank. And don't rain on their parade. Many of the Republican presidential candidates hitting the campaign trail today as former President Trump cements his frontrunner status, sparking serious alarm from some allies of Ron DeSantis. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Peter Alexander, and today for Kristen Welker, a happy 4th of July to you on America's Independence Day. Sadly, again, we begin with America's gun violence epidemic. In the 23 hours since we came off the air yesterday, 7 more communities in this country have experienced mass shootings. That's according to the Gun Violence Archive. The group defines mass shooting as an event in which 4 or more people are shot, not including the shooter. Last night in Philadelphia, police say a gunman armed with an assault weapon and a handgun, also wearing body armor, shot and killed 5 people, wounding 2 others, including a toddler. Authorities say they have that gunman in custody. And moments ago, the police chief reacted to the horror of this crime.
What happened last night in our Concession neighborhood was unimaginably disgusting and horrifying. On what was supposed to be a beautiful summer evening, this armed and armored individual wreaked havoc, firing with a rifle at their victims, seemingly at random, shooting 7, killing 5, including children, babies. Such an act of violence is abhorrent and goes against everything we stand for in this community.
Also last night, police say at least 3 people were killed, 8 injured during a community gathering in Fort Worth, Texas. No suspect there has been identified. It was one of just 3 reported incidents of gun violence in Fort Worth last night. We're going to take you there live in just a moment. Then police in Baltimore, they're still looking for the suspect in this past weekend's mass shooting that left 2 people dead and 28 others injured. There have now been at least, get this, 346 mass shootings in the U.S. so far since the start of this year. That's according to the Gun Violence Archive as well. A year ago today, a gunman opened fire on an Independence Day parade in Highland Park, Illinois. You remember that. It killed 7 people, wounded more than 45 others. Highland Park did not hold a 4th of July parade this year in the wake of last year's tragedy. Instead, local leaders held a ceremony in honor of those killed.
This is a day filled with emotion. While I am so proud of how our community has supported one another these last 12 months and today, I wish it were not because of a horrific act of mass gun violence. We don't need the date or the holiday to remind us about what happened. We live with it every day. Each one of us, even as the world moves on, the loss and the pain will never leave us.
And look at this. Since that tragedy in Highland Park a year ago today, this country has suffered 675 mass shootings. That's approaching an average of 2 mass shootings each day. Earlier today, President Biden, reacted to the recent mass shootings and the 1-year anniversary at Highland Park, renewing his calls for Congress and state legislatures to ban assault weapons. For more, we are joined now by NBC's Rahema Ellis, NBC's Priscilla Thompson. She's in Texas, and NBC's Jesse Kirsch. He is there in Highland Park, Illinois today. Rahema, I want to start with you if we can. What do we know about the investigation into the shooting in Philadelphia? We did just hear from the police commissioner there.
Yeah, well, the first thing we know is that a 40-year-old man is in custody tonight. Authorities say they feel confident that they have the man responsible for this. And the reason they're so confident of that is they say that police literally chased this person on foot into an alley, and they were able to apprehend him without them firing a shot and preventing this suspect from firing any shots that could have led to other people being killed. Peter, as you mentioned, 7 people were shot, 5 of them dead. All 5 of them are men, starting with a teenager, a 15-year-old, and going up to a 59-year-old. One thing we should mention here is that in this news conference held within just the past hour, we learned that police say there were 4 bodies that were found on the street of Philadelphia. Several hours later, they found a man at home. He lived alone, and they didn't find him and discover his death until then. But now what they're telling us is that the last person whom they found dead was the first person whom they believe that the suspect killed. And from there, he went out into the streets and began randomly shooting people and even firing at cars. And that's how one of the children was injured in this incident. And what this person, they say, now what happened in the street may have been random. They're not sure about what happened in that home. They say that this person was wearing a ski mask. He was armed with an AR-15, a handgun, another gun. Police say he was also wearing a bulletproof vest and had a police scanner. That tells them very clearly, according to them, that this person was intending to cause harm and did so. Peter?
Raham Ellis with the very latest on that awful situation in Philadelphia. Another separate situation we're investigating, or police are investigating right now, is that shooting in Fort Worth. Priscilla, what more are we learning about the situation there?
Yeah, Peter, we just got an update from police in Fort Worth moments ago. They are saying that it is reported that there were several unknown males that fired indiscriminately into this crowd of people and then fled the scene. And one thing that police are working to make clear is that there was this Como Fest that occurred earlier in the evening where hundreds of people were gathered for that community celebration block party, but that this was an incident that happened after that event had ended. Clearly, people had decided to continue that gathering perhaps in a different part of the neighborhood whenever all of this violence unfolded. And as you noted, there are 11 victims here, 3 people who were killed and 8 who were injured and hospitalized, including 1 juvenile among those victims. But what police described when they arrived on the scene was chaos, that this was a scene that spanned a number of blocks, that there were vehicles everywhere, there were people on foot everywhere when they arrived. They were able to find multiple shooting victims in a parking lot, but there were still some areas where they weren't even able to get ambulances in because of how many people were here. One officer had to put a victim in their car and transport them to an ambulance just because of how chaotic this scene was. And we're now hearing from the mayor there. She works to comfort this community. I want to play a little bit of what she had to say.
Well, it's heartbreaking. It's incredibly disappointing. The first thought I thought about was the families and neighbors that make Como Fest so successful. Hours of family-friendly fun and beautiful fireworks turn into a deadly mass shooting. And so I think in the next few days they'll uncover to kind of figure out who the perpetrators were. But it's senseless, man. You know, you had people come in to a family environment with guns and start shooting randomly.
Just incredibly heartbreaking circumstances. And of course, the question, why did this happen? Why did these people do this? Police saying that they still do not have, they are following leads today, but they still don't have any suspect or suspects who have been identified. They did make it a point to say that they do not believe any of the victims are suspects, but still searching for answers here about the kinds of guns that were used and, of course, the motive. And police here also saying that they're going to have additional staff on hand heading into the holiday festivities tonight. Peter?
Priscilla, thank you for that. Jesse, I want to get to you in Highland Park right now. It's hard to believe it's been a year since that awful tragedy took place, disrupting, interrupting, destroying the peace and celebration of the 4th of July parade. How was this year's festivity, this year's honoring, different than what they had last year?
Yeah, so, Peter, this year is a mix of somberness but also celebration. And I think the one word that sums up what we saw from this community today is a mission of defiance, trying to honor the lives lost, the 7 people who were killed on this day in this community last year in what the mayor described as the bloodiest day in the history of Highland Park, while at the same time honoring those people, but at the same time not letting a gunman's action actions control how this community sees this day moving forward, being able to still have July 4th, Independence Day, as a celebration in some way. That said, that you're seeing visuals from a ceremony they held earlier. They had a moment of silence at the time when the gunshots began to ring out on this day last year. They then, behind me here, went on a walk. This was the parade route in 2022. This year, there was no parade. They had a walk, and there were hundreds of people filling the street. And again, at the same time, we saw people wearing Highland Park T-shirts, but there were also people in the Stars and Stripes, the American flags out there as well. So a bizarre blend that we are unfortunately having to see in this community this year. That's what it looked like earlier, but there are going to be more moments of celebration as well, and a mix of tributes blended in there. For example, Gary Sinise, the actor, and the Lieutenant Dan Band will be performing later. So there will be like concerts, right? There's food. There are some of those cornerstones that we expect with July 4th, but at the same time, right behind me here today was a moment of memorializing as well, Peter.
Also, in many ways, that community really a place for hope for those activists who want to see stricter gun laws, a place where they found some progress in the face of that awful pain a year ago. Jesse Kirsch on the ground in Highland Park. Jesse, thank you so much. And still ahead right here, we're going to take you live to the Middle East as the Israeli military says some of its forces are withdrawing from the Jenin refugee camp that is in the West Bank after 2 days of a massive military operation there, while the Hamas militant group praises a new terrorist attack in Tel Aviv. Plus, an ongoing Secret Service investigation inside the White House into a white powdery substance found in a West Wing work area. We have brand new reporting. That's ahead. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back to Meet the Press Now. There are new concerns today about the prospect of escalating violence in the Middle East as the Israeli military pushes ahead with its operation aimed at targeting Palestinian militants in the West Bank, its biggest incursion into the occupied territory there in 2 decades. Earlier today, 8 people were injured in Tel Aviv when a Palestinian driver rammed a car into a crowd of people at a bus stop. The video shows the moment just after that car attack. The attacker then got out of his car and began stabbing people. He was then killed by an armed civilian who was in the area. Hamas, which the U.S. and Israel have both designated as a terrorist organization, praised the attack. They called it a, quote, natural response to Israel's ongoing military operations in the West Bank. That operation in Jenin, in the West Bank, it continued for a second day today. Palestinian health officials now estimate 12 people have been killed. 100 others, they say, have been injured, including 20 in critical condition. An Israeli Defense Forces spokesperson now says that part of their forces have started to withdraw from the area of the Jenin refugee camp. While visiting Israeli troops near Jenin, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Israel will continue as long as necessary to uproot terrorism and would not allow Jenin to go back to being a refuge for terrorism. Joining me now is Matt Bradley, who is on the outskirts of Jenin in the West Bank. Also, Ambassador Dennis Ross, former National Security Council Senior Director for the Central Region and former U.S. envoy for the Middle East. Mr. Ambassador, we'll get to you in a moment. But first, Matt, on the ground there, tell us about the situation, what you were seeing, and this new reporting that the Israeli Defense Forces say they are now beginning to withdraw from Jenin.
Yeah, we just heard that just now, actually. We had that confirmed that the Israeli Defense Forces are now withdrawing from Jenin. We think we saw what was kind of the last part of that operation. We saw, while we were interviewing some Palestinian youth who were engaged in fighting against the Israelis, we were kind of on the outskirts, and then all of a sudden, the Israelis pushed in for a clearing operation, and the Palestinian youth were firing on them. And what we saw was the Israelis using armored cars and one of their armored bulldozers, which is what they've used to great effect in Jenin to try to clear the area. But, this operation was something, as you mentioned, that Benjamin Netanyahu has basically said, mission accomplished for now. And he said that he's going to continue to move into Jenin if necessary. And this whole thing was basically prompted by intelligence information, according to the Israelis, that this was an operating area, Jenin, that had been used to launch terrorist attacks, as the Israelis would call them, onto Israel proper. So what we saw were a lot of Palestinian youth who were throwing rocks and Molotov cocktails at the Israelis. They were also firing small arms. So there was live ammunition. And this has been an operation that has been going on, as you mentioned, for the past 2 days and has resulted in now one increase in the death toll. It's now 12 people who have been killed, and thousands of Palestinians were forced to leave Jenin. And it wasn't just the entire city that we're talking about. It was mostly the refugee camp inside Jenin that the Israelis had been targeted. And as you mentioned, this was a huge operation and one that was unprecedented before 20 years ago during the Second Intifada. So this has been a real big effort by the Israelis, and a lot of this has been prompted by the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu is now in power, and he has a very right-wing government that is backing him. And they are all cheerleading this operation, and they will be cheerleading any operation that comes forward ahead. As Benjamin Netanyahu has promised, he will continue to push into West Bank cities like Jenin to try to flush out what they call any militant operations that are originating from there. So I think, Peter, that we can expect to see more of this style of violence in the days and weeks ahead. Peter?
Yeah, and Matt, the violence is not unique to that side of the border between the West Bank and Israel. What is your sense of the security situation in Israel right now after that car ramming attack we saw? What sort of heightened alert is there across Israel, and particularly in those major cities, including Tel Aviv?
Well, it's pretty rare to see that kind of attack inside Israel proper. Whether or not this continues, I think that what a lot of folks here are mostly worried about is whether other elements of Palestinian resistance are going to join in, whether Hamas is going to start launching rockets from the Gaza Strip, whether we're going to start to see other armed groups here in the West Bank pick up their guns and engage in fighting. A lot of these people, these militants who were being targeted in Jenin, they weren't necessarily part of any organized group, and that's what the Israelis have said have made them really so dangerous. They're difficult to placate, difficult to negotiate with, because they don't really have any allegiance to any formal structure. And so I think we could start to see this kind of wildcat violence continue.
Matt Bradley on the ground for us in the West Bank tonight. Matt, continue to be safe. We appreciate your reporting there. I do want to bring Ambassador Dennis Ross into this conversation now. And Mr. Ambassador, I know we have seen over the past not just years but decades these sort of fits and starts of fighting, the potential for escalation. But this really did feel like a new escalation at a level, certainly in Jenin, that we hadn't seen in decades. Why now, and what is your number one concern about what's happening right now?
Look, I think the reason for it is that the Palestinian Authority, as such, has almost no control over Jenin. Palestinian security forces have not been going into Jenin, certainly not been going into the refugee camp. And one of the things the Israelis became increasingly aware of is that many of the attacks on Israelis, at least in the West Bank, shooting attacks, were emanating from Jenin, especially from the refugee camp, and people who would go out, shoot at Israelis, either succeed in killing them or wounding them. They would then get themselves back into Jenin and into the refugee camp. So I think the Israelis, as the more they found that the PA, the Palestinian Authority security forces, would do nothing, they began to operate more and more with what would be small raids in to try to arrest those who they thought were responsible for individual acts. I think they became more and more concerned that the nature of the infrastructure that had developed in terms of arms, explosives, bomb-making labs, they became more and more concerned that this was going to produce a wide escalation and perhaps a large number of deaths. And so they acted to try to disrupt that infrastructure, destroy as much of it as they could, arrest those they felt were organizing it. And they understood this wasn't going to end acts of terror coming out of the West Bank, but it could disrupt it, it could buy time. And if they create the right circumstance in terms of really reducing the level of the threat from there, you might see the Palestinian security forces begin to go back in. It's the absence of any Palestinian Authority efforts from security to deal with that. By the way, not only in terms of that infrastructure, which also can become a threat to the Palestinian Authority, but also basically we're seeing a lot of lawlessness in the West Bank. And so this is really designed to get them to see if they can act so the Israelis don't have to.
And as you say, it's that vacuum of leadership that the Israelis and the U.S., the West feels has really sort of created this situation there in the West Bank. I want to ask you about Iran and their effort to fuel this Palestinian resistance in a moment. But first to the U.S. and the U.S. role here. The White House, Mr. Ambassador, said yesterday it was monitoring this situation, language you would expect from them. But what is the U.S. role here, and what should it be?
Look, I think it has to have a couple of elements to it. One gets at what we were just talking about before. There needs to be very thoroughgoing reform of the Palestinian Authority, because the reason the Palestinian Authority security forces are not acting is because increasingly the Palestinian Authority has lost any legitimacy. If there isn't widespread reform of a place that has become dysfunctional and largely corrupt, you're not going to see security forces feel they can go and act in defense of that authority. Now, if in fact we do what we can to try to help promote that reform, which we've done in the past, by the way, different administrations have done that, that also creates, I think, an appropriate lever on Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government. If you have, for example, a new prime minister who comes in who is empowered to carry out reform on the Palestinian side, the Israelis have got to engage in a way that makes it easier for that prime minister to operate, demonstrates that what they're doing actually is successful, so the prime minister builds his authority and becomes more credible and then can act more. So that is a major role, I think, for us to play.
Then let me ask you about the role of Iran here. We heard from the Iranian mission to the United Nations today saying that Iran will support any request for assistance from the Palestinian Authority right now, effectively saying that force was the only means by which the Palestinians could fight this effort by Israel. What do you make of that brazen willingness to sort of fuel this conflict from that end? And how do you counter that? How does that complicate the circumstances, not just for Israel, but for the United States there?
Look, I think one of the things the Iranians have been trying to do, and you in the report made it clear that many of these attacks are not the function of organized groups like Hamas or Islamic Jihad. You have a lot of 17 to 26-year-olds who are unemployed in the West Bank. You have to be 27 to get a work permit if you're a Palestinian to work in Israel. Many of the 17 to 26-year-olds who are very active in Jenin and in Nablus, they're unemployed. They're frustrated with what's going on vis-a-vis Israel, but also frustrated with regard to the dysfunction and corruption of the Palestinian Authority. And one of the realities is that they act largely as individuals, less as groups. Now, what the Iranians have been doing, along with Hamas, is pouring money into Jenin and to Nablus, also explosives. So they've already been trying to take advantage of this. From the Iranian standpoint, if the Israelis they're going to do as much as they can to put pressure on Israel, and that's what they've been doing. So you cite the brazen language. The truth is it just simply reflects what they've already been doing.
Ambassador Dennis Ross, we appreciate your making time and sharing your expertise on this holiday. Thank you very much. Coming up next right here on Meet the Press Now, it is a time-honored 4th of July campaign tradition, a parade of presidential candidates. You're watching that and Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. If it is Tuesday, he's running. Literally, Miami Mayor, Republican candidate for president Francis Suarez ran a 4th of July 5K this morning, using this as an opportunity to highlight his fitness for the country's highest office.
That's why I'm here today. I want to show that I'm a fit presidential candidate and someone that has the stamina and the energy to run this country.
Meanwhile, many others in the sprawling GOP field are also hitting the trail today, albeit at a slower pace, joining 4th of July parades in some of those key early voting states. Ron DeSantis, Tim Scott, Doug Burgum, Will Hurd, all joining Independence Day celebrations in New Hampshire. Mike Pence and Asa Hutchinson, they spent their day in Iowa. Notably absent from these parade routes, Donald Trump. The former president remains the clear frontrunner headed into the summer months, despite 2 criminal indictments and 2 additional ongoing criminal investigations. And that's where we get going here. Joining now this discussion about the state of the race is Maria Teresa Kumar, the president and CEO of Voto Latino, and an NBC News contributor, also former North Carolina Republican Governor Pat McCrory. Nice to see both of you. Happy 4th of July. Governor, to you first. We saw the Miami mayor literally running a 5K today. Other Republican candidates stressing their fitness, perhaps not as physical, but in similar efforts today. Is this about making a contrast with the 80-year-old president right now that they're competing to run against?
Right now, they're trying to do anything to get some attention. When you've got a pack of candidates like I've had to do running for mayor and governor in the U.S. Senate, you've got to do anything to get attention. And the dilemma the other candidates have, including the mayor, senators, former governors, is that all the attention is focused on one person who is taking all the oxygen in the room, because he doesn't have to go to a 4th of July parade. He can show up in downtown Charlotte or Raleigh or Florida or New York and draw a crowd or draw the media. So it's very difficult to be a candidate against someone who takes all the oxygen in the room. And I commend the mayor for trying. I've been there. I've done it. They all think they're something special. They all think they're something special. They think they're the it person. Every candidate thinks they're that way. I did. And they're waiting to be found. And we'll see whether it happens or not.
Maria Teresa, I want to ask you about this. The president, he says he exercises 5 days a week, but no matter what the White House does, no matter how much, how many photos they put out or video of him on his bicycle riding around, he's still an 80-year-old guy. So how big of a challenge is this for the White House as it relates to fitness for office, the man's age? Look at that. Americans right now, 68% say it's a major or moderate concern.
Well, for an 80-year-old, he sure has gotten to work and perhaps passed some of the most historic pieces of legislation that we have already ever seen. And I think that what we have to recognize is what has he done in office in the last 2 years? He has been able to actually increase broadband to perhaps most rural communities. He's dropped down the cost of insulin to $35. He is responsible for the most complex infrastructure bill that we've done, while also delivering perhaps the most robust investment in climate legislation and climate justice to a tune of close to $500 billion, the most of any developed country in the world. So while people like to say that age is a concern of them, we should also recognize that because he's such a seasoned statesman, he's been one of the few members sitting in the White House that have actually understood, sitting presidents, who actually understood how to legislate with Congress and the Senate. And he's delivered on his promise. He's actually done most of this legislation as a bipartisan type of legislation that is delivering to the local level. And what I expect to see for the president and the Vice President Kamala Harris in the next 18 months is going to these neighborhoods, going into these communities, reminding them of what they've been able to deliver, that, yes, he might be older, but it's age and his ability to deliver that it actually has him in the capacity to show what that means and to have that ability to be able to demonstrate that he's delivering results.
I can't tell you how many times a White House aide has said to me in recent months, implementation, implementation, implementation. Demonstrate what the White House has already accomplished to this point. Governor, let me ask you about President Biden's challengers, though. The 4th of July, always a pretty good mark where we sort of see where we are in the presidential primary. The DeSantis campaign is now notably admitting that they're stuck way behind. This is Steve Cordes from the Maine DeSantis Super PAC. Here's what he said on Sunday. Listen.
Right now in national polling, we are way behind. I'll be the first to admit that, okay? I believe in being really blunt and really honest. It's an uphill battle. I don't think it's an unwinnable battle by any stretch, okay? But clearly Donald Trump is the runaway front runner.
Governor, how did we get here where the DeSantis campaign ends June weaker than they were before he even entered the race? I mean, there was so much ammunition and money behind this effort, and that's a pretty candid assessment that it's not unwinnable, but it's a big uphill battle.
Well, I've never seen a political advisor be so honest on either side of the party, and I got to give him credit. He's honest, but he's probably looking at his money not coming in now because people were giving DeSantis money thinking he was the most viable candidate to take down Trump. And that's not happening. He still is in the first tier or in the second tier where everyone else is in the third tier. But I think that he's got to look for some national event, some national issue I don't think they can wait to the debate to make things change. I think they've got to find something, and it's not going to be a 4th of July parade. And with Biden, with all due respect, he looks old, and that is his problem. And the other problem is inflation at the grocery store. When I just got back from shopping for 4th of July burgers today, and I'm shocked at my bill. And that's what the Biden administration is fighting right now. Regardless how they sell the accomplishments, it all comes down to the supermarket and how you look and the energy you have. Whether that's right or not, that's politics.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, the White House will look at job creation, and obviously they'll say the economy keeps growing right now. They still got a ways to go. They got to pass in the primary. Maria Teresa, the Republicans don't. DeSantis, though, right now, he faces a real sort of back-to-the-wall moment, right? He's trying to do what Ted Cruz did in 2016, run to Trump's right in hopes of winning Iowa. Does that play in this era? Is that enough? Can you outflank Donald Trump?
Well, DeSantis is kind of like, he's like Coke Zero. Why go for Coke Zero if you could have Coke? In this case, Donald Trump being Coke. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges that DeSantis has. He's trying to demonstrate that he is all the trappings of Trump, but even slightly more to your right, as you suggested, Peter. And I think what would have benefited him more would have been to really target libertarians and talking about personal freedoms and talking about the ability that he was going to respect people's privacies, because that was one of his strategies. That was one of the reasons why he decided to declare his candidacy on Twitter, was because he was going after that libertarian vote. But the fact that he keeps, again, tacking to the right and trying to take away personal freedoms, he doesn't really have a base as a result. And so where does he go from here is going to be really interesting.
Yeah, well, we're going to be keeping a close eye on this, and today is always a good day to sort of take a progress report, a check on those things. So thanks to you, Governor Maria Teresa Kumar, Pat McCrory. I appreciate both of you being with us here. And coming up next, breaking news about that white powdery substance found at the White House. We'll have the latest. I just spoke to a source, what they're telling me this afternoon. Plus, our country is facing a crisis in military recruitment. We'll look at what that could mean for military readiness and national security, and a surprising reason that children of veterans are not following in their parents' footsteps. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. As I mentioned, we have new reporting right now on that white powdery substance that was found in a work area inside the White House's West Wing. A source familiar with the investigation tells me that during a preliminary field test completed by the D.C. Fire Department Sunday night, the substance tested positive as cocaine. That source also says that the substance was found in a small dime-sized bag. NBC's Mike Memley joins me now from outside the White House. Mike, this is kind of a startling situation here, right? The question being, and it could have been a preliminary test, we'll wait to see whether a final test is conclusive, but how and who would have got this into the White House?
Yeah, that's right, Peter. I mean, we certainly didn't have this on our news bingo card on this Independence Day, but it was significant to learn that this, one, it was not a hazardous substance, but one that is certainly an illegal substance, and two, the part of the White House in which it was discovered. This was a uniformed officer as part of the U.S. Secret Service's uniformed division who was conducting a routine patrol of the White House on Sunday and discovered this. Now, the fact that it was in the West Wing is important. It narrows down the real estate. It wasn't the executive mansion where we have most of the ceremonial spaces as well as the private residence for the first family. It wasn't the executive office building across the street, which is a much more occupied part of the real estate where most of the executive staff works. We're talking about the West Wing, where obviously the Oval Office, the president's senior staff, and their assistants work. So that obviously leads to the question that is being posed into the West Wing right now. How did this material come into the White House? It could have been a White House staffer. It could have been somebody who was being escorted as part of a meeting in the White House, or it might have been somebody, as we often see on the course of weekends, staff often are giving tours to members of their family and to other guests. And so that's just one of the questions now that's going to be posed to the White House. It's also worth noting that the president and other members of the first family were not at the White House. President Biden, the First Lady, as well as his son Hunter and his family departed the White House on Friday and only returned today, this morning, where, of course, the president tonight is going to be hosting a barbecue for military families and others on the South Lawn to celebrate the nation's birthday today, Peter.
Mike, you're there at the White House. Are they saying, or officials there saying anything about this discovery?
No, we're only hearing at this point from the Secret Service, which has outlined the ways in which this was discovered and the investigation steps going forward. You can be sure, as White House officials are joining those on the South Lawn, they're also asking this question because this is certainly an embarrassment to the White House. This is something that, as we know, is an illegal substance that officials here are going to be highly scrutinized. I think the story itself got a lot of attention, especially on social media today, largely from the president's critics. And so there's going to be an effort very quickly to try to get to the bottom of what happened here so they can try to diffuse some of that speculation.
Yeah, no doubt. Mike Memley there with you. You can hear some protesters, activists, and others in the background there outside the White House as well. Mike, thank you very much. Happy 4th to you. It has been more than 50 years since this country first launched a war on drugs. And now a new war on drugs is emerging as a key 2024 campaign issue. The DEA calls fentanyl the, quote, single deadliest drug threat our nation has ever encountered. Chuck recently sat down for an exclusive interview with Ann Milgram. She is the head of the Drug Enforcement Administration. And here's part of their conversation.
What makes fentanyl so much worse right now than any of these other crises that we've had over our 50-year war on drugs?
So thank you for having me and giving me the opportunity to talk about what I think is the most critical issue in the United States today, which is the fentanyl crisis, where the CDC has just reported that last year over 110,000 Americans have died from fentanyl and methamphetamine poisoning. About 200 Americans are dying every day from fentanyl. What I say all the time right now is that this is not a war on drugs. This is a fight to save lives. We are losing Americans in every single community from coast to coast and every single place in between. Fentanyl is now, and what's one of the things that's really different about this, a few things. First, it is the deadliest drug we've ever seen widespread. It is 50 times more powerful than heroin. And so if someone does,
Even the legalized version of this drug that was FDA approved is 50 more times deadly.
Well, what we're talking about now is the illicit or
I understand that, but this was originally a legal drug.
Yes, and just to make sure, to be clear on this, it is tightly controlled as a lawful drug given in hospitals, often for cancer patients and end of life as patches or put in under someone's tongue. What we're talking about is totally different. What we're talking about started in Mexico in 2014, 2015, where the criminal cartels, and in particular the Sinaloa cartel, realized that they could take chemicals and make drugs. And so one of the ways that this is so different than any other threat we've ever seen is that these are man-made or chemical drugs. Unlike heroin or cocaine that are grown, you
still need a crop, right? And you could find the crop, maybe even eradicate a crop.
Yes. Yeah. This is totally different. This is chemicals. And what's terrifying about this in so many ways is that the only limit of the amount of fentanyl that could be made is the amount of precursor chemicals that can be purchased. Right. And so these are the chemicals that can be used to make fentanyl. The other reason why I think this is so different, and it is really worth staying on this just for a minute, is that fentanyl, tiny quantities, are so highly addictive and potentially deadly that what we see the cartels doing is they're hiding that fentanyl powder in other drugs, like cocaine, like heroin, like methamphetamine, and they're pressing into these fake pills made to look exactly like oxycodone or Percocet or Adderall when it's just fentanyl and filler. So tens of thousands of Americans are dying without having any idea that they're taking fentanyl.
What does victory over this fentanyl scourge and saving lives look like in the next year or two?
Yeah, so I mean, to me, the core thing that we have to be focused on is Americans who are dying, right? So, we can talk about as much as we seize. We seized enough fentanyl last year, 410 million doses. That is enough deadly doses to kill every single American.
And yet, how much do you think got through?
So this is, we know.
We don't know how much got through,
We don't know the exact amount that got through, but we do know, we brought thousands of cases against individuals across the country. We announced them in April that are associates of the cartels, and they're selling the pills on social media. They're selling it on streets, so we know some is getting through. So first of all, we have to save lives, and we have to do everything we can to push that number down. The second piece, which I think is really important, is we have changed the way we work. Our mission right now is to save lives by defeating these two cartels that are responsible for almost all of the fentanyl in the United States, the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco cartel, and we have to stop the fentanyl from being made.
When it comes to your ability to choke the supply, we have two countries that are not doing business with the United States on an honest basis. One is China, and I'd argue the other is Mexico. And I'd ask you this, these cartels, who's in charge of Mexico? Is it the government, or is the government afraid of these cartels?
So what I would say is, our relentless focus right now is on these two cartels. And while there are two countries that are the major, obviously Mexico is where Sinaloa and Jalisco are based, and the vast majority of precursor chemicals are coming from China. We are now tracking these two cartels in more than 45 countries, many of whom are good partners to the United States. And so as we look at this as a global supply chain issue, we are able to do work that we have never done before.
I understand that, but the Mexican president basically denied that, we don't make fentanyl here. I mean, he is totally not, I mean, he at least in public, does not seem like he accepts the premise that this fentanyl issue is a problem in Mexico.
One of the things that we did in April, we announced charges against the Sinaloa cartel. I would argue to you that they're the leaders right now in fentanyl trafficking to the United States.
And what has the Mexican government done to help us with this?
But just to go back to your initial question, what we showed in those charges, and that case is still pending, but what we showed is that there's no question that fentanyl, as alleged in the indictment, is being synthesized in Mexico.
Right.
So there are many things that we are doing and investigating through our cases that I think are critically important.
But are you getting cooperation with the Mexican government on this?
So where we are now, and I think where we are right now is, first, the United States is now taking an across-government approach. And so in the past 6 months, 12 months, we have sat with Treasury, we have sat with state, we have sat with other federal law enforcement agencies. And I think it's really, and the Deputy Attorney General has been to Mexico, as has the President's Homeland Security Advisor, and they're all delivering the message of how important and critical this is. So what we are seeing is some increased cooperation with Mexican law enforcement and the military. Now, what I would say to you, I think it couldn't be said enough. We cannot allow 110,000 Americans to die.
So let me ask you about the cartels. Would your job be easier if they were designated as foreign terrorist organizations?
So DEA has vast authorities. We have the ability to prosecute cases under the 959 statute globally. If there was a foreign terrorist organization designation, that would not change our current authorities.
Do you think border politics, because it's so polarizing, and frankly, it can be used as a way to try to hijack the fentanyl issue, maybe positive or negative, makes it harder for this Democratic administration to talk about it because they don't want to talk about the border issues?
I think there is, what I've seen over the last 2 years is a fundamental shift in people's willingness to talk about it, and including just walking into a room. I almost do not walk into a room right now where someone hasn't lost a loved one or someone in their community, and that has changed over the last 2 years.
So you feel like there's a shift over the last couple of years?
I feel like there's a shift. Do I think we're where we need to be yet? No. I think way too many Americans still don't understand that on social media, that, where your kid might be, that pill is potentially deadly, and there are no second chances. And so I think we have to continue to increase awareness.
Is our fentanyl issue a bigger problem at the border or a bigger problem in social media?
So, the border is an important part of this conversation because most of the fentanyl that we see coming into the United States is coming in through the southwest border. In the indictments we announced in April, what we've charged is that the fentanyl is coming in through every way possible, by air, by land, by sea, by underground
Usually
tunnel.
by Americans?
By both.
Okay.
By both. But essentially coming in at very high rates through the southwest border, often in trucks or cars. But yes, coming in through the border. It's an important part of the conversation. Social media is also a vital part of the conversation. It is what I call the last mile, because what the cartels need, they're selling the deadliest poison we've ever seen. They need that to get into.
They need a platform to advertise.
Exactly. And they also need to be able to expand and sell more. They need to be able to reach people at massive rates, and that's what social media is doing.
Is social media companies at all cooperating on this?
We've been in conversations with the social media companies. The Deputy Attorney General convened all of us in April of this year and made it very clear, number one, that the companies have to comply with their own terms of service, which say this is illegal. You cannot be selling fake pills. You cannot be selling drugs on the social media websites. Number two, law enforcement needs to get information from the social media companies. We have not, until recently, gotten nearly as much cooperation as we need. And finally, this is an outright emergency. So they need to be doing absolutely everything they can to get the deadly drugs off their platform.
There's a lot more of Meet the Press, and it's special on the fentanyl crisis on our website. It is at meetthepress.com. And coming up next here, the dangers of the U.S. military's steep recruitment decline. This is a really striking new headline. And what can be done to address the shortfall in this country's all-volunteer force? That conversation next. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back on this Independence Day as members of our armed forces are being honored and celebrated at the White House and around the country. The U.S. military is in the middle of what is a massive recruiting drought. In 2022, the U.S. Army had its most difficult recruiting year since it ended the draft in 1973. Other branches are struggling too, leaving the Army, Navy, and Air Force roughly 30,000 recruits short of their goals. There are all sorts of explanations for the shortfall, including the pandemic, a tight labor market. But one reason appears to be the experiences of veterans themselves. According to the Wall Street Journal, more and more veterans are urging family members against enlisting. That does not bode well for an Army where nearly 80% of all new recruits have a family member who served. And joining me now is the retired Army Colonel, Jack Jacobs. He is, of course, a Medal of Honor recipient and an NBC News military analyst. Colonel Jack, on this holiday, as always, we say thank you for your service. And this is a heck of a headline about the all-volunteer force in the U.S. right now. The former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Mullen, told the Wall Street Journal about prospective recruits. He said the following: influencers are not telling them to go into the military. Moms, dads, uncles, coaches, pastors do not see it as a good choice. What's your take?
Well, it used to be a good choice, and we had generations of people joining the military because previous generations had. I did because my father had served in the Second World War in the Army in New Guinea and the Philippines, and I thought it was my obligation to serve. But a lot has happened since we decided to have an all-volunteer force. The result has been far fewer people going into the military to start with, which leaves far fewer people trying to influence those who would otherwise come in. It's interesting to note that a very large percentage of people who enter the armed forces now, something on the order of 78 or 79%, have a family member who has served, but only 30% have a parent who served. And that number is coming down, too. In an environment in which you could do just about anything and make some money, coming into the military seems to be an option that not many people are selecting.
Well, you make a good point there, right? And now there's this new competition for those individuals, for those potential recruits right now, where often going into the military is a way to sort of secure your future, your education would be guaranteed, it'd be paid for. But now there are a lot of other routes that young people in this country are finding to do that, separate from the military. And it's not just that. There's obviously sort of a fatigue associated with the recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So how do you flip the switch on this? How does the military change this trajectory?
Well, that takes leadership. Just about anything you want to accomplish, whether it's in this environment or any other kind of environment, takes leadership. And we have not had leaders who've done a very good job of convincing the rank and file of the American public that if you're lucky enough to live in a free country, you owe it something in the form of service. What's happened now is that so few people are serving, not because necessarily recruitment is down, but because the requirements of the service are such that we are taking only volunteers and we don't have a draft, is that a wide gap has opened up between those who are serving and those who are being served. Statistically, most Americans do not know anybody in uniform. This is a really dangerous situation when you're separated from those who, in some cases, are risking their lives to make sure that you remain free and the United States achieves its foreign policy objectives. The only way this will change is through leadership. It's interesting to note, for example, that more people were killed on 9/11 in New York City than were killed at Pearl Harbor. And yet, on the 8th of December, 1941, hundreds of thousands of young people streamed to reception stations to go defend the country. That did not happen after 9/11. At the end of the day, I go back to what I said before. It takes leadership. Right. And if you can't motivate people to go defend their country after 9/11, then it's going to take extraordinary leadership to change that.
Yeah, notably, remarkably, a lot of the people you'd be recruiting, though, to be fighting or to joining the military were not even born when 9/11 took place now 22 years ago. And this is a bigger issue, not just about recruiting, Colonel Jack, but it's also really about America's military preparedness going forward with these emerging conflicts or competitions with China and Russia. So what does it mean for our readiness? If we went to war today, say China decides to go into Taiwan, how confident are you that we have the personnel that we need, plus personnel sort of in the pipeline in place?
Well, one can't have very much confidence in the current circumstances. Among other things, the military's discovered that a fairly significant proportion of people who even want to come into the military are not physically capable of being in the military, or who have rap sheets, drug problems, and so on. It's very, very difficult to even get people who are qualified who want to come in. The second thing to keep in mind is some services are far more vulnerable than others. You can make Army units smaller and so on, and they can or can't do their job. But at the end of the day, if you go into someplace like the Navy, which is heavily equipment-centric, you got to have people in the right military occupational specialties, and we don't have those.
Yeah, it's a good point you make, Colonel Jack Jacobs. Always a pleasure to be with you. And again, a happy holiday to you and to your family here. Thank you again for your service. We thank you for being with us on this 4th of July.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.